Can a single gunshot change the fate of an entire continent? In the summer of 1914 in Sarajevo, one sound, one moment dragged millions into history's darkest war. But that bullet didn't fall into silence. It landed on decades of rivalry, fear, and rising tensions. This episode reveals how the spark was prepared.
That bullet had actually been waiting for years. Across the continent, power struggles, nationalism, rivalry, and fear had been piling up. On the surface, Europe looked wealthy, modern, and strong, but underneath, it was growing fragile and ready to explode.
Europe's leaders had built a giant chessboard of alliances and secret treaties. Every move unsettled another power, and the tension grew year by year. No one wanted a great war, but everyone was prepared for one.
And so, the summer of 1914 arrived. No one realized it, but Europe had already become a massive powder keg. The spark in Sarajevo didn't create the explosion, it simply lit what was already waiting.
At the start of the 20th century, Europe entered one of the fastest periods of change in its history. Every year, trains were faster, factories were larger, and cities were more crowded. Newspapers spoke of a modern world being born, yet few realized that this growth was also feeding a growing danger.
As industrial wealth grew, nationalism rose everywhere. Each nation saw itself as stronger, more independent, and more deserving than the rest. Crowds marched through the streets demanding a new Europe, but this new Europe would be built on rivalry, not peace.
In this climate, Europe slowly split into two major camps. On one side stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances appeared to exist for peace, but in reality, they formed a chain reaction waiting to ignite the entire continent.
These alliances did not bring safety. Instead, they triggered an arms race. Nations expanded their armies, modernized their navies, and developed new weapons. Each country believed it was defending itself, but from the outside, it looked like all of Europe was preparing for war. In this environment, European leaders reacted to even the smallest crises with fear. Diplomatic tables were no longer places of peace, but centers of mistrust. Every meeting, every treaty created new suspicions, and the atmosphere grew tighter with each passing month.
By the early 1910s, Europe was like a pot at full boil. Nationalism, economic rivalry, colonial competition, and alliance pressure all converged into one point. Europe was ready to explode. All it needed was a small spark.
The unification of Germany in 1871 changed Europe's balance entirely. This new nation was growing fast, powerful, ambitious, and unpredictable. For years, Bismarck's diplomatic brilliance kept the continent stable, but the fragile balance he built would soon give way to rivalry and distrust.
The new Germany was becoming an economic giant. Steel, coal, railways, all expanding at an astonishing pace. Germany's rise deeply worried France and Britain, because Europe's youngest power was now its fastest growing.
When Kaiser Wilhelm took the throne in 1888, Europe's future began to shift again. He was young, ambitious, and impatient. First, he dismissed Bismarck. Then, he decided Germany should take a much more aggressive role on the world stage.
Wilhelm's Germany wanted more power, not just in Europe, but across the world. Colonies, sea routes, and trade networks, these were the prizes of the great powers. This race pushed Germany into a dangerous collision course with Britain and France.
Germany's decision to build a massive navy caused panic in Britain. The nation that had ruled the seas for centuries would never accept such a challenge, and so a dangerous naval arms race began between the two powers.
This rivalry wasn't just military, it was psychological. Every new ship, every new factory became a symbol of threat to the other side. Europe had turned into a continent ruled by fear.
In the early years of the 20th century, Europe's balance collapsed completely. Distrust, nationalism, and rivalry had grown too deep to reverse. From this point on, war was only a matter of time, and the spark was no longer far away.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire looked strong from the outside, but inside, its multi-ethnic structure was cracking. Hungarians, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, each wanted more rights, while the central authority grew weaker every year. This giant empire was slowly sliding into an internal collapse.
The Ottoman Empire was exhausted after centuries of territorial losses. The Balkan Wars delivered a heavy blow. The economy was strained, and the army struggled to reorganize. The state wanted to modernize, but internal problems stood in the way.
Russia was a vast empire, but boiling from within. Growing dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime, strikes, economic crisis, and poverty had pushed society to its limits. This nation was about to enter not only a war, but a revolution. Western Europe's great powers, Britain and France, appeared strong from the outside, but internal pressures were rising. Economic stagnation, colonial troubles, workers' movements. Trust between the public and governments was fading, and unrest was growing. All major European powers shared the same problem: weakening economies and rising social unrest. Unemployment, high prices, strikes, and increased taxes shattered the public's trust in the future. In such an atmosphere, even a small crisis could trigger enormous consequences. As rivalry grew between nations, anger accumulated among the people. Every group felt neglected, and everyone blamed someone else. In such an atmosphere, peace was no longer a realistic option. By 1914, all major European empires were coming apart piece by piece. Internal pressures grew, nations pulled away, and governments were losing control. The continent stood on the edge of a massive storm, and the event that would unleash it was about to take place in the Balkans.
In the early 20th century, the Balkans were the most complex region in Europe. Different nations, different religions, and centuries of rivalry had turned it into a room filled with gunpowder. A single spark here could set the entire continent on fire.
After gaining independence from the Ottoman Empire, Serbia witnessed a rapidly growing wave of nationalism. Its goal was clear: to unite all Serbs living across the Balkans. This ideology posed a serious threat to Austria-Hungary.
Bosnia and Herzegovina, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, was a mosaic of nations. Bosniaks, Serbs, Croats, all living in the same streets. But this diversity was also a source of deep tension. Serbia's growth and rising nationalism alarmed Austria-Hungary. Verbal clashes, diplomatic crises, and threats grew between the two nations. Everyone knew this tension would eventually explode.
In this atmosphere, young revolutionary groups emerged. One of them was Young Bosnia. Radical youths seeking independence were ready for armed struggle against Austria, and this movement was preparing for an assassination that would change history.
According to some historians, the Serbian Secret Service covertly supported planned attacks against Austria-Hungary. This link was never fully proven, but the atmosphere of the time made it highly plausible. The Balkan crises were now the focus of all Europe. Newspapers warned that any war in the region would drag the great powers into conflict. The continent held its breath, waiting for an explosion. Daily life in Sarajevo appeared normal, yet beneath the surface, people sensed something was approaching. Soldiers were appearing more often in the streets, and police checks increased noticeably. During this period, a young Bosnian named Gavrilo Princip emerged as a revolutionary driven by radical beliefs. Raised in poverty and fueled by ideals of freedom, his name would soon be known by the entire world.
As Archduke Franz Ferdinand's visit to Sarajevo approached, Princip and his companions began to move. To them, this visit was an opportunity, and that opportunity would change the course of world history.
In the early 20th century, the Balkans were the most complex region in Europe. Different nations, different religions, and centuries of rivalry had turned it into a room filled with gunpowder. A single spark here could set the entire continent on fire.
At the start of the 20th century, the great powers were competing not only in Europe, but across the entire world. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, maps were constantly redrawn, territories fought over. This competition had become a global source of tension.
Africa was the fiercest arena of European competition. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, all raced for the continent's resources. This process became a struggle that shook both Africa and European politics. One of Germany's greatest fears was entering the colonial race too late. While Britain and France held vast empires, Germany had gained very little. This created frustration and anxiety in Berlin.
Britain was the unquestioned ruler of the seas. Its navy was essential for protecting global trade, so Germany's construction of a massive fleet was seen as a direct threat in London.
In 1906, Britain built a massive warship called the Dreadnought, instantly making every other navy outdated. The ship was so powerful that other nations had no choice but to imitate it. The race had reached a deadly new level. Germany's response came from beneath the waves, the U-boats. Silent, invisible, and deadly, these submarines showed the world what future wars would look like.
U-boat attacks began threatening Britain's trade routes. Every ship sunk brought the two nations closer to war. The seas had become minefields of tension.
Colonial competition created new crises not only in Africa, but across the world. In Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, every dispute increased the tension between the great powers. By 1914, both the colonial race and the arms race had spiraled out of control. No nation could back down anymore, and no leader could say, "Stop." The world was drifting toward a great war, ready to fall.
In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand planned an official visit to Bosnia. His aim was to strengthen loyalty in this critical region of the empire. But this visit would soon become one of the greatest tragedies in history.
Despite all warnings, the security arrangements for the visit were extremely weak. The route was publicly printed in newspapers. For an assassination attempt, the opportunity could not have been better.
The Young Bosnia movement had been preparing for days. Weapons were smuggled into the city, and each member positioned themselves. They all waited for one single target, the Archduke's car.
The atmosphere in Sarajevo was tense. Life appeared normal, yet there was an unusual unease in people's faces. The city felt that something catastrophic was coming.
European newspapers highlighted the significance of this visit. Some saw it as a political message, others as a display of power. But no one imagined it would mark the beginning of a world war.
Some intelligence reports warned of a possible attack, but Austrian officials dismissed these warnings. Once again, history would be shaped by the small details everyone ignored.
After the Sarajevo assassination, Austria-Hungary made its move. On July 23, 1914, it delivered a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. The conditions were so severe that accepting them was nearly impossible. Europe's heartbeat quickened. Everyone asked the same question: is this the beginning of war?
Serbia accepted most of the conditions, but Austria was not satisfied. On July 28th, war was declared. This single decision triggered a chain reaction. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Suddenly, Europe was on fire.
This was not just a declaration of war. It was the first great war of the industrial age. Millions of soldiers boarded trains within days. No one imagined it would last 4 years or erase an entire generation.
In some cities, there were celebrations. In others, silence. Young men stood in line for uniforms. But deep inside, everyone felt the same. This war would not be like the others.
Germany's nightmare was a two-front war. Russia in the east, France in the west. The only solution: defeat France quickly. And this plan entered history, the Schlieffen Plan.
Crafted by General Alfred von Schlieffen, the plan required almost mathematical speed. The army would sweep through the north, enter France, and encircle Paris. The only problem was Belgium's neutrality. But for Germany, militarily, it was the only viable path.
On the morning of August 2, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian border. The shock across Europe was immediate.
Speed was expected. Resistance was not. Belgium's heroic defense began slowing the entire plan. Germany pushed ruthlessly to regain momentum. The fall of Leuven sparked outrage across Europe. Germany expected to march through Belgium with ease, but Liège stunned Europe. The small Belgian army resisted the massive German assault for days. The thunder of modern artillery echoed across the continent. Liège was expected to hold, and this resistance disrupted Germany's entire timetable. The Belgian army was small, but its courage was immense. They fought street by street, house by house. Women, elders, and even children supported the defense. Bridges were blown, roads blocked, and the German advance lost not hours, but days. This delay would be large enough to change the fate of the entire war. When Belgium's neutrality was violated, Britain's decision was clear. On August 4, 1914, London declared war on Germany. The Royal Navy mobilized immediately. This was no longer a regional conflict, but the beginning of a global war.
Germany could not advance at the speed it expected. Every Belgian resistance point disrupted the clockwork precision of the Schlieffen Plan. The German army marched toward Paris, but time was no longer theirs. It belonged to history.
Germany's breakthrough in Belgium sent a wave of panic across France. Newspapers printed darker headlines by the day. Germany advances. Belgium is collapsing. We might be next. Crowds filled the streets of Paris, waiting for the government's response. France stood at the edge of one of the greatest crises in its history.
Facing Germany's rapid advance, the French army began to retreat. It was not a collapse, but a sign of deep concern. Soldiers were exhausted, roads were crowded, and supplies were running thin. As the German army marched closer to Paris, France held its breath a little more each day.
By the end of August, the German army had reached just 40 kilometers from Paris. A silent fear gripped the city. The government prepared for evacuation. Some streets emptied. Shops closed their doors. Paris was preparing for one of the darkest days in its history. Just as despair filled the air, something unforgettable happened. Thousands of Paris taxis were mobilized to carry soldiers to the front. Ordinary citizens took the wheel to change the fate of their city. The scene became a symbol of French resistance. Paris had not surrendered yet. By September 1914, the German army was at the gates of Paris. But French commander Joffre issued a desperate counterattack order. Troops were rushed east of the city. Taxis, trucks, and trains all poured toward the front. Along the Marne River, a new battle was forming. And this battle would decide the fate of Europe. On the morning of September 6th, the French army launched a counterattack along the entire front. Infantry moved through the mist. Artillery filled the sky with fire. German units were stunned by the sudden assault. Trenches changed hands, and every hill was fought over for hours. The Marne had become a deadly chessboard.
For the soldiers at the Marne, there was no turning back. Both sides were reaching the end of their strength. When bullets ran out, they fought with bayonets. Wounded men crawled on the ground with no stretchers left. The air was filled with smoke, fire, and death. It was a hell no soldier would ever forget.
After days of brutal fighting, the German army began to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Paris was saved, but the war was far from over. In fact, a new nightmare was beginning. 4 years of trench warfare. While the fighting raged on the Western Front, something unexpected happened in the East. Russia mobilized far faster than anyone had imagined. Vast armies advanced toward East Prussia. German commanders were stunned because, according to their calculations, Russia's preparations should have taken months. Yet Russian soldiers were already approaching German soil. Panic spread across East Prussia. Villages rang warning bells. Civilians fled westward. The German High Command had committed nearly all strength to the Western Front, leaving the East dangerously exposed. In Berlin, fear took hold. What if East Prussia fell before the Schlieffen Plan succeeded? This question left German leadership desperate.
Germany's worst nightmare was unfolding. A two-front war. France and Britain in the west. Massive Russian armies in the east. As German generals searched for a solution, the Russians advanced in two separate armies. Rennenkampf's First Army and Samsonov's Second Army. If they united, East Prussia would be lost. Germany now faced one of the most critical choices in its history.
As the crisis in East Prussia intensified, Berlin made a decisive move. Veteran General Paul von Hindenburg and the ambitious young commander Erich Ludendorff were placed in charge of the Eastern Front. The moment they stepped off the train, they began studying the maps. The situation was dire, but there was an opportunity. The Russian army was split in two, and communications were weak. Hindenburg and Ludendorff began crafting a plan that would enter military history. The Russian army struggled to coordinate. Telegraph lines were unsecured. Messages went unencrypted. German intelligence could listen directly to Russian commanders' communications. It was an advantage rarely seen in modern warfare. Hindenburg now had more than maps. He had the Russians' plans.
Rennenkampf's First Army advanced slowly. Samsonov's Second Army moved alone from the south. The gap between them widened, and the Germans planned to strike right into that gap. Hindenburg and Ludendorff rapidly redeployed their troops to form a massive trap. Without even realizing it, the Russians were being encircled.
Between August 26 and 30, 1914, the Russian Second Army was fully encircled. There was no escape. Ammunition ran out, units fell into chaos. German artillery closed the trap. Most of Samsonov's army was destroyed. It was a disaster for Russia and a massive morale surge for Germany.
In the summer of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian army advanced into Serbia. Many believed this small Balkan nation would collapse within weeks, but Serbia had prepared a strong defense behind its mountains, supported by both the Chetniks and the regular army. Austrian troops suffered heavy losses while attempting river crossings. Serbia was expected to fall quickly, but the war was only beginning.
Serbia's geography became a deadly trap for Austria. Narrow valleys, steep slopes, and dense forests were a nightmare for the invaders and an advantage for the defenders. Serbian units attacked in small groups and retreated into the mountains. Every bridge and every pass became a brutal contest.
By November 1914, the Austro-Hungarian army had reached Belgrade. Many believed Serbia's end was near. But General Stepa Stepanović launched an unexpected counteroffensive. Despite exhaustion and hunger, Serbian soldiers charged down from the mountains. The attack caught the Austrian forces completely off guard.
By the end of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian army suffered a major defeat and was driven out of Serbian territory. Belgrade was retaken. This victory proved that even a small nation could resist a great empire. But this triumph would be temporary, because an even greater storm was approaching.